Hi there, welcome back to my channel. I'm Ian, the gay ADHD reader. I'm gay, I have ADHD, and I read. Get over it. In this video, we're doing nonfiction books. So I'm just naming 10 of my favorite nonfiction books that just immediately came to mind or I had on my shelves. Turns out I have 9 nonfiction books that I've read that I love and own, and then one that I don't own that I've read and I'm going to mention on the video. So I was like, well, why not just do 10? This isn't going to be in any particular order. I don't remember what I rated any of these, so please do not ask. But pardon any background noise. I live near a ton of restaurants, and so we get a lot of Cisco trucks. That is not a paid sponsorship. Forgive any background noise, but I'm going to go ahead and dive into 10 of my favorite nonfiction books for Nonfiction November. Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. So this was supposed to be a movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio, directed by Martin Scorsese, and they did Killers of a Flower Moon instead. I guess that's just what happened, which I own but have not read. This is about the first documented serial killer in the US. And Erik Larson also ties this into what is simultaneously going on in Chicago at the time, and that is the Chicago World's Fair, which was, I did not know how amazing of a feat the World's Fair was, honestly. The Ferris wheel was invented for the Chicago World's Fair, which I find really interesting. So I'm the kind of person that I actually really like urban infrastructure and find that really interesting. And so there was a lot of talk of like they engineered everything in the city around the World's Fair, like essentially rebuilt the city around the World's Fair. They changed the flow of the Chicago River. They also upgraded like the plumbing system in the city, but all of this for the World's Fair, which for those of you that don't really know much about the World's Fair, it was basically an exhibition for like the future, and it lasted for decades and used to be hosted kind of all around the world. So when it came time for Chicago, this is what put Chicago on the map. The serial killer portion, if you're into true crime, put those two together, you've got like pretty niche but really interesting way to tell a true crime story, but then also touch on something that could otherwise be really boring, like infrastructure. So check out The Devil in the White City if you haven't yet. Up next is Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. So I think I read this maybe in November 2019 before the pandemic. I got a few months in where I actually did practice digital minimalism. I deleted all social media off of my phone. I had certain times where I would pick up my phone and other times where I wouldn't touch it at all. And I thought it was going to be really, really hard, and it just wasn't. It was, I would say, like the few days it was hard, but I think what's more jarring when you practice that digital detox and you realize how you so physically reflexively reach for your phone, you don't feel so bad about not being on social media. You also realize like how little you miss, how wonderful it is to actually like catch up with friends, either like talking on the phone or video, or the best one is like in person. Digital minimalism is Cal Newport's manifesto on like how bad our phones can be. There's a lot of really good information in here. I think that there is room for this to be put back to the forefront, especially after the pandemic, when our survival really relied on technology then, and the only way we were able to communicate was through technology. But he is making the case that that is simply not enough in order to feel fulfilled, in order to feel joy, in order to gain skill and feel enriched. Like there's so much in here that lays out how poor technology is in actually satiating our social appetites. Whenever I pop on the internet, I don't take anything seriously, and especially reading the science behind this and the science that continues to come out every day. Like, I love spending time watching BookTube. I love getting to know people through BookTube. I love being able to communicate with people like through this platform, and yet at the end of the day, everyone is curating everything about their lives. And that's great. That's fine. You should. You get the control to do so. That's your prerogative. That's fantastic, actually. However, these social interactions are only so genuine, are only so authentic, and are only so enriching and fulfilling. And this book helped me realize that. If you get nothing out of this book, at least be able to reprioritize what social interactions are most important and be intentional about it, because that's what this book is really all about, is the intentionality around the use of technology. This actually changed my life and makes the internet a much easier place to be, even when it is at its absolute worst. This next book is a doozy. It's like 800 pages. It's called These Truths by Jill Lepore. So this is very much in the style of like Howard Zinn. This book kind of revolves around the quintessential American idea of equality, natural rights, and the sovereignty of the people. Jill Lepore is basically saying, has the US done that? And the answer is, for the most part, no. So this is like a refocusing of American history around really important social movements throughout US history. And I think that's a really interesting way to view things. This book goes through into like 2018. So it does touch on fairly recent history, especially I think there's an afterword in here where it touches on some politics. And I thought that this was absolutely fascinating. There were so many things that I didn't even know occurred in US history. This is stuff that's not taught in the history books. If you're a fan of Howard Zinn, if you're a fan of social movements and sociology and US culture, like this is the history about those things. Honestly, one of my favorite books of all time. Speaking of histories that are rarely told, I will probably talk about this book a million times, but it's an Indigenous people's history of the United States, and this was written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who is a Latinx Indigenous person. This encompasses hundreds of years of history in like less than 300 pages? Is it less than 300 pages? Yeah, it's less than 300 pages. So we're skimming the surface here, but here's the thing. This is an entry point for those of us who don't know much about Indigenous history in the US specifically, and maybe you are even doubtful of the history that you learned in the public education system, or really any education system. This is the entry point to better understanding those like basic 101 accounts told from the perspective. I highly suggest that everyone read this. Again, this is not a be-all, end-all. Like, I think you start with this, and then you go and do more, and you read more about Indigenous history. But if you're looking for something in the month of November, Indigenous Peoples History Month, this is it right here. Okay, so full disclosure, I haven't read this book in a long time, but I remember reading it and it had such an impact on me. I imagine that it is nothing compared to some other progressive works that are coming out nowadays, but at the time it was a lot. It's a heartbreaking work of staggering genius by Dave Eggers. It is a memoir, and it's about the author whose parents suddenly died and he had to take care of his younger brother at a young age. The book is like, I mean, what makes it so unique is stuff like this, right? Like, this is the back of the book. And it's also, you have to like flip it. Even there's some like graphics in here too. Like stuff like that. Really different book, really interesting book. It was also like told very funny and self-deprecating, but also very serious and very touching. I remember crying a lot. And this is one of those memoirs that kind of changed the way people could write memoirs. So even though this may seem dated now, I recall this coming out and this being like, this is different and this is what people are in the mood for. So for some biography, Professor and the Madman, this has a British title that is totally different and I cannot remember what it is. So this is about the gathering of the Oxford English Dictionary, right? So if you think about it, dictionaries weren't always online. Before that, they were in print. And before they were in print, they were in people's minds. And that's what this is about. This is about extracting all of the knowledge from as many different experts as possible and putting it into a comprehensive volume known as the Oxford English Dictionary. I love anything words related. I was not prepared for how engrossing this is. And especially there is a twist in here that is just like, excuse me? I assume a lot of people probably already know about this. I think there's maybe a movie or a miniseries that was made. I don't remember if it has the same title, but I think it does. Anyway, the twist in here was just like, wait, this is how biographies can be written? Like, it was so next level for me. It ends up being about the relationship of the man who's putting together the Oxford English Dictionary and Dr. W.C. Minor, who they are in constant correspondence. Dr. W.C. Minor providing words to be put into the English dictionary because he had access to such a large library. And it's believed that he was perhaps the largest contributor, at least like outside of the project itself, It says on the back 10,000 entries. So this guy is really important, the history of the English language. And it gets a little crazy. It's one of those where it's not talked about a lot, but anyone who reads it really, really likes it. Next is The Mother Tongue by Bill Bryson. I listened to the audiobook for this, which I love. I am a linguistic nerd, apparently. The whole book, I can't even suggest this to anyone. I really don't even know why I'm mentioning it here. The whole book is about how the English language came to be, and also how silly the English language is, how weird dialects are, how words came to be in writing, and I loved this. But this is gonna be for a nerd, and I realized that I was such a linguistic nerd until I listened to this audiobook. The audiobook is the narrator pronouncing words for you so you can hear how ridiculous they are. But I devoured this. I finished this in 2 or 3 days. It's not a short audiobook either. So that's my little nerd plug. If you're a nerd like me too. Another memoir that I read this year and really loved was Stay True by Hua Shu. So this is about an American Taiwanese boy whose best friend was murdered in a carjacking incident. The first half of the book is really about their friendship and just kind of slice of life almost, what their dynamic was, where each was coming from, and then also this happened in Oakland in the Bay Area, and so you also get an idea of what Oakland was like in the 90s. It's kind of atmospheric in that way. So the first half of the book is really setting things up, and it's mentioned on the back. This is not and then his friend died. It's mentioned very matter-of-factly in the middle of the book. I specifically loved how matter-of-fact it was. Felt very dry to all of a sudden be and then this thing happened. And it was a bit jarring to go from building up their friendship to suddenly that friend is just gone. I'm getting chills just thinking about it. The author is still processing the loss of his friend, the murder, the senselessness, and still processing his own inability to fully process it. He's recalling how he got through things. He's recalling what he in his journals at the time. But at the end of the day, it still feels like it's a really raw part of him that he may never recover from. He probably won't recover from. That's not how grief works. If you're a big fan of music, especially 90s music, there's a lot of mention of music in here. They were both very into music. The writer is a really interesting person. I loved how he wrote about their friendship because he really emphasized the simple things that occur over any given day that accumulate to build something into a friendship that is a bond that can never be broken. I think I like memoirs. Actually, I know I like memoirs. I've been really avoiding that for most of my life. I read 84 Charing Cross Road by Helen Hanff. So this is an epistolary memoir, epistolary meaning letters, and it is all letters from this woman who wrote to a bookstore, writing from New York City to a used bookstore in London, and she was in search of specific books. And I think this starts in 1940s, very post-war, World War II. It's purely told in letters, just back and forth between the two. This is no plot, all vibes. It's super duper short, but this spans 30 some years, and you start to see things change, for the writer herself and also the man that she's consistently corresponding with back and forth. But they forge this friendship that is separated by an ocean with no internet to bring the two together. All they have is these letters, and it's beautiful. The woman is also, I love her. She's a bit crass, right? She probably drinks a little too much, smokes a little too much, but she's a really interesting character. It's so short, you can finish this in a day. Last but not least, the final memoir book kind of changed my life, if I'm being honest. And that's What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu. So I'm sure a lot of you have been hearing a lot about complex PTSD. This is the book that has really brought that to the forefront. Stephanie Fu was not the first person to talk about it or write about it, etc., but she's really the first person to be able to take the ideas, the tenets, the patterns of complex post-traumatic stress disorder and plug them into a really digestible, really interesting memoir. So trigger warnings for especially the first half, because what Stephanie Fu does is sets up what CPTSD can look like based on the traumas of her childhood. And then the latter half is really an exploration into what CPTSD is, what it does to the body, and how on earth we can cure ourselves. Guess what? There's no cure, but there are ways to make life vastly better. This book, I read it on a day where I was not well, and all I did was pick up this book and I read, and I knew that my life needed to change, upon reading this. It occurred to me that most of us who suffer from traumatic experiences, either in adulthood or childhood, and for those of us who are neurodivergent, are going to have to continuously work at being consistent in taking care of ourselves. Stephanie Fu, I love this because this is really, at the end of the day, this is a memoir about someone who is curious about their brain, is curious about the world in which they have to exist with that particular brain, and is curious despite there being no real reason to be. Who is she curious for? Herself. If you have ever felt like you just don't have enough control over your brain, if you have felt like people hate you and no one loves you, and if you have felt like the things that happened in your childhood were bad, but not bad enough to be anything other unpleasant, then you have to read this. You will feel so seen and so justified. All right, and those are my non-fiction November picks. Oh my gosh. Would love to hear what your favorite non-fiction book is, especially if it's a memoir. If you have a favorite memoir, I want to hear about that, and I want to hear about it right now. So go ahead and comment below, give a thumbs up, subscribe, notification button, all the things. Really appreciate you coming around. Have a wonderful day and happy reading.